The leather strap bit into the boy's wrists, drawing blood that trickled down his small fingers. 11-year-old Nathaniel Warren didn't cry out. He'd learned months ago that tears only made his father hit harder. Instead, he stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as the tall shadow of his father fell across the stable floor. 3 horses for 1 useless boy, his father bellowed, spittle flying from his whiskey-soaked lips. A damn bargain. The stranger examining Nathaniel circled him, slowly poking at his ribs, checking his teeth like a horse. Nathaniel kept his eyes fixed on a point beyond the barn door, where summer light spilled across the dusty yard, where freedom might exist if he could only reach it. He's scrawny, the stranger said, voice flat as the Wyoming plains. But I reckon he'll fill out if he's fed proper. Nathaniel's father grabbed a handful of the boy's hair, yanking his head back. He's strong enough, worked these fields since he was 5. When Nathaniel finally raised his eyes to meet the strangers, there were no tears, no pleading, only a burning, steady flame that refused to be extinguished. The stranger saw it and nodded, seemingly satisfied with what he found. Done, he said, counting out 3 gold coins. The horses are yours, the boy's mine. As his father untied him from the post, Nathaniel made a silent vow. Someday he would be the one making choices. Someday he would make men like his father pay. 12 years later, Eleanor Hayes stood with her spine pressed against the rough wooden wall of the auction barn, trying to disappear. The dress that had once belonged to her mother hung loose on her thin frame, the collar yellowed with age and stained with memories. Her fingers twisted in the worn fabric, seeking comfort where none existed. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering against the roof like impatient fingers. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of horses, unwashed men, and something worse, anticipation. "Final lot for today," announced Marcus Blackwell, a man whose smile never reached his cold eyes. "Unclaimed bride, virgin stock." Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the dirt floor as rough hands pushed her forward onto the raised platform. Her bonnet shaded half her face but couldn't hide the purple bruises that bloomed along her jawline like poisonous flowers. Through the curtain of her lashes, she surveyed the crowd. 20 or so men leaned against fence rails or sat astride backward chairs. Some smoked pipes, trailing lazy curls of smoke toward the rafters. Others passed a bottle, laughter growing louder with each swallow. 4 girls had already been sold that morning. None had screamed, at least not loudly enough to matter. "Starting bid is $3 silver," Blackwell announced, gripping Eleanor's chin and tilting her face toward the lantern light. His touch wasn't rough, but it wasn't kind either. It was the indifferent handling of merchandise. Eleanor's eyes swept the crowd once more, desperate for some sign of humanity. Instead, she caught sight of something unexpected. A small figure crouched between barrels at the back of the barn. A boy no more than 8 years old with dirt-smudged cheeks and wary eyes. He was watching her intently, as if memorizing her face. "No takers at 3. Blackwell's voice cracked like a whip. "Disappointing. She's intact, gentlemen, guaranteed." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Eleanor tried to breathe past the knot in her throat. Maybe if no one bid, they would let her go. Maybe if $3. The voice came from the back of the room, low and clear as a mountain stream. Heads turned. A tall figure stepped forward through the haze of smoke. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to danger, coat dusty from the trail hat pulled low over his eyes. Unlike the others, he didn't leer or smirk. His face remained impassive as he approached the platform, boots striking the wooden floor with deliberate steps. Blackwell's eyebrows rose. "Nathaniel Warren, didn't expect to see you at one of my auctions." Nathaniel didn't answer. He simply counted $3 silver into Blackwell's outstretched palm, each coin landing with a decisive clink. Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze as he assessed her, but strangely it didn't make her skin crawl like the others had. When he finally looked into her eyes, she saw something unexpected, recognition, as if he'd been searching for her specifically. Blackwell smirked. "She's all yours, Warren. Though I must say you've overpaid for such a skinny—" "I claim nothing," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. And then, to the astonishment of everyone in the barn, he knelt. One knee touched the dusty floor as he positioned himself before Eleanor, not looking up at her like property to be claimed, but meeting her at eye level. Even the horses seemed to still the only sound, the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. "You don't belong to them," he said softly, fingers moving to the cracked leather of her boots. With gentle movements, he unlaced them, his touch against her ankles, light as a breath. "And you don't belong to me." Eleanor stared down at him, confusion warring with the first fragile bloom of hope. "I just paid for your silence from monsters," he continued, voice pitched for her ears alone. Then even more surprisingly, he leaned closer and whispered words that made her heart stop. "Thomas is waiting for us. Your sister's boy." Eleanor nearly collapsed. Her sister had died years ago, leaving behind an infant son she'd never met. How could this stranger know about Thomas? How could he know about her before she could find her voice to ask? Nathaniel rose in one fluid motion, removed his coat, and draped it around her shoulders. The wool still carried his warmth and smelled of pine and open sky. "This transaction is complete," he announced to the room, then turned his back on every man present and walked toward the door, not checking to see if Eleanor followed. She did not because she trusted him, but because he had spoken her nephew's name and because he hadn't asked her to come. The choice impossibly had been hers. As they passed the barrels at the back of the barn, the small boy she'd noticed earlier slipped from his hiding place and fell into step behind them, keeping to the shadows like a well-practiced ghost. Rain hammered against them as they crossed the muddy yard to where a wagon-weighted canvas top stretched tight against the downpour. Nathaniel helped Eleanor up without touching more than her hand, then turned to lift the boy into the back. "You did good staying hidden, Thomas." He said something gentle, entering his voice when he addressed the child. The boy nodded solemnly, eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "Is she really my aunt?" he asked, his voice small against the rain. "She is," Nathaniel confirmed, climbing onto the driver's bench. "Your mother's sister." Eleanor sat stiff beneath Nathaniel's coat, trying to process this impossible turn of events. Thomas, her sister's son, alive and here. And this man who knew things he shouldn't, who had knelt instead of claimed. "How do you know who I am?" she finally asked, as the wagon pulled away from the auction, barn wheels cutting deep tracks in the mud. Nathaniel's eyes remained fixed on the rain-slicked road ahead. "Your mother wrote to me before she died. Asked me to find you." "My mother didn't know any Nathaniel Warren." "No," he agreed, "but she knew what I did, what I do." Lightning cracked across the distant hills, illuminating his profile for a brief moment. The straight nose, the stubborn jaw, the watchfulness in his posture. Eleanor flinched at the thunder that followed, and she noticed how Nathaniel slowed the horses without comment. "And what is that?" she pressed. His mouth tightened slightly. "I find people who've been lost, or sold." In the back of the wagon, Thomas had wrapped himself in a blanket, eyes drooping despite his evident desire to stay awake. Eleanor turned to study him, this nephew she hadn't known existed. He had her sister's eyes wide set and observant, but his jaw was all stubbornness, reminding her of her father. "How did you find him?" she asked softly. "He found me," Nathaniel replied. 6 months ago, hiding in my stable, half-starved." "Where had he been?" "Orphanage in Cheyenne after your sister passed, then taken in by Judge Holbrook and his wife." A muscle twitched in Nathaniel's jaw. They didn't treat him kindly. Eleanor absorbed this anger, flaring bright and hot. Her sister dead, her nephew mistreated, and no one had thought to find her. Then she remembered there had been no one to tell. After her mother died, she'd been alone working as a seamstress for Mrs. Garfield, sleeping in a tiny room above the shop, until her uncle had come claiming she owed her mother's debts. They crossed a narrow creek swollen with rain and climbed a winding ridge. Just past a line of frost-bitten pines stood a cabin, low, sturdy, with a chimney exhaling slow smoke into the gray sky. Nathaniel stopped the wagon and stepped down first, making no move to help Eleanor descend. She climbed down on her own legs, stiff from the cold and tension. Thomas had fallen asleep, and Nathaniel carefully lifted him from the wagon bed. "It's warm inside," Nathaniel said, nodding toward the cabin door. "You don't have to enter." But where else would she go? Eleanor pushed wet hair from her face and followed him up the path. The cabin smelled of pine and ash, with a fire working steadily in the hearth. It was simply furnished: a table with chairs, a bed in one corner, partitioned by a curtained shelves lined with books and jars. On the table sat 2 plates side by side. Nothing fancy, just bread and what smelled like rabbit stew. Nathaniel carried Thomas to the small trundle bed tucked against the far wall and laid him down, gently removing his shoes, but otherwise leaving him dressed. He covered the boy with a thick quilt, his movements practiced and careful. Eleanor stood awkwardly near the door, still wrapped in Nathaniel's coat, unsure of her place in this strange tableau. "There's a blanket on the chair," Nathaniel said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "The fire holds all night." He walked to a shelf, took down a kettle, and poured water into a tin cup, which he offered to her without approaching too close. "What now?" she asked, not taking the cup. He set it on the table instead. "Now you breathe." She didn't move, her hands still tight on his coat. "Why did you bring me here?" "Because this is a place with no locks." He turned to face her fully, and in the firelight she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the weariness, and something else: resolve. "No one will force you to stay. No one will force you to leave." She didn't trust it. The silence, the stillness, the lack of demands. She'd been raised on sharp words and slammed doors on debts called favors and favors called sins. "I'll eat," he said, sitting at the table and breaking the bread with both hands. "You don't have to." Eleanor watched him for a long moment. He didn't look up, didn't watch her, didn't do anything to pressure her decision. Finally, her hunger and exhaustion won out over caution. She stepped forward slowly, not because she believed him, but because her body craved rest more than her mind demanded vigilance. She sat at the table as far from him as possible and took the spoon he passed her. The stew burned her tongue, but she didn't care. It was the first hot meal she'd had in weeks. "What's your name?" she asked between careful bites. "Nathaniel Warren." "I'm Eleanor Hayes. This is—" He nodded. "I know." Of course he did. He seemed to know everything about her, while she knew nothing about him, except what he'd chosen to reveal. "Why did you kneel?" she asked suddenly, his hands stilled. "Because everyone else stood over you. I thought someone should meet you eye to eye." When the fire dipped low, he rose and added 2 fresh logs. The sparks leapt toward the chimney and vanished. She waited for him to ask something, to demand payment in some form, but he didn't. Instead, he placed a second blanket near the hearth. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll stay near the fire." Eleanor stared at the space, the soft wool, the stillness of his hands. "I don't want to be touched," she said, not angry, just stating a fact she'd had to repeat too many times. "I won't touch what isn't offered," he replied simply. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, her heart beating loud in her ears. The day's events swirled in her mind: the auction block, this stranger kneeling, the revelation of Thomas's existence. It was too much to process. Eleanor lay down near the hearth, not taking the bed. The floor was hard beneath her, but the blanket was soft and the fire's warmth seeped into her bones. She kept her eyes on Nathaniel, watching as he sat in a chair by the window, cleaning a revolver with methodical precision. "Sleep," he said without looking up. "Nothing will harm you here." She didn't believe him, couldn't afford to. But for the first time since her mother died, she slept without flinching at every sound. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and the soft murmur of voices. She lay still beneath the blanket, eyes on the cabin's rough-hewn rafters, heart quiet. For a moment she thought it might be a dream, this place with its warmth and strange safety. Then she heard a child's laugh, bright as a copper penny, and remembered. Thomas, her nephew, the man who had knelt. She sat up, smoothing her hair and dress as best she could. Morning light streamed through the windows, turning dust motes to floating gold. At the table, Nathaniel sat, showing Thomas how to clean a fish, their heads bent together over the task. "See, you want to cut away from yourself," Nathaniel was saying, guiding the boy's small hands on the knife. "Slow and steady wins the race." Thomas nodded solemnly, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Like this. Just like that. You're a natural." Neither had noticed Eleanor yet, and she took the opportunity to study them unobserved. Thomas had her sister's coloring, dark hair and eyes against fair skin. But there was something in his serious expression that reminded her of their father, a man gone so long she barely remembered his face. Nathaniel was different in daylight. The dangerous edge she'd sensed yesterday was still there, but tempered by something gentler. His hands, guiding Thomas's through the delicate work of deboning a fish, moved with the confidence of someone who had survived by their own skills. "Good morning," she said finally. Both heads turned. Thomas's face lit up with naked hope, while Nathaniel's remained carefully neutral. "Aunt Eleanor." Thomas abandoned the fish and came toward her, stopping just short of touching her. "You're really here." The naked longing in his voice broke something inside her. This child, her blood, had been waiting for her without her even knowing he existed. "I'm here," she confirmed, her voice rougher than she intended. She knelt to his level, mirroring what Nathaniel had done for her yesterday. I didn't know about you, Thomas. If I had, I would have come sooner. His eyes, so like her sister's, studied her face. Mom said you were the best at stories, that you made up adventures about princesses who saved themselves. A memory surfaced. Eleanor and her sister huddled under blankets, whispering tales by candlelight, while their parents argued downstairs. She had forgotten those stories, buried them beneath years of survival. Would you like me to tell you one? She offered. Thomas nodded eagerly, then glanced at Nathaniel. After breakfast, Mr. Warren makes the best flapjacks. Nathaniel stood at the stove, sleeves rolled to the elbows, working a skillet as if he'd done it 100 times before. He didn't turn when Eleanor approached, just poured coffee into a second cup and set it on the counter. Thank you, she said, reaching for the cup. Her fingers brushed the warm tin, then stopped. Why are you doing this? He turned, then eyebrows raised slightly. Doing what? Treating me like I matter. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. His answer was steady and without hesitation. Because you do. She took the cup and retreated to the table, unsure how to respond to such simple certainty. Nathaniel slid 3 golden flapjacks onto Thomas's plate, then 2 onto a plate for Eleanor. He took only 1 for himself, Eleanor noticed. They ate in silence, broken only by Thomas's occasional questions about the fish he'd been learning to clean or the books that lined Nathaniel's shelves. The boy seemed at ease here, comfortable in a way that spoke of time and trust. After breakfast, Nathaniel took Thomas outside to check the horses, leaving Eleanor alone in the cabin. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly look at her surroundings. The cabin was small but meticulously maintained. Books lined one wall, not just practical manuals, but poetry, philosophy, histories. A desk in the corner held papers neatly stacked, a pen and inkwell, a small carved horse. On the mantel, above the fireplace, sat a wooden box, its surface polished by frequent handling. Curiosity drew Eleanor toward it. She hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside lay a single coin worn smooth with time and a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline made her breath catch: Cattle Baron's son hanged for murder. The article, dated 1875, detailed the execution of Benjamin Hayes, her father, for the murder of a rancher's wife. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read. Her father hadn't abandoned them, as she'd always believed. He had been hanged, condemned as a killer. In the grainy photograph accompanying the article stood a group of men watching the hanging, and among them, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a boy, thin, solemn-faced, with eyes that seemed to bore through the camera. A boy who could only be a younger Nathaniel Warren. He didn't do it. Eleanor spun around the box, clutched to her chest. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, watching her with unreadable eyes. My father, she said, not a question. Nathaniel nodded once. Benjamin Hayes was many things, but not a murderer. How would you know? The words scraped her throat raw. How are you connected to my father? Nathaniel stepped into the cabin fully, but kept his distance. Your father worked for the man who bought me from my own father. Henry Warren, no relation by blood, just by purchase. He gave me his name because he couldn't be bothered to remember mine. Eleanor tried to process this. My father worked for the man who owned you. Not owned, not legally, but yes. Nathaniel's voice remained steady, but his eyes had gone distant. Your father was the foreman. He saw how Henry treated me, tried to intervene once. And that's why you helped me. Some debt to my father. No. Oh, the word was soft but firm. I helped you because you needed helping. The connection to Benjamin is complicated. Eleanor replaced the box on the mantel, mind racing. If my father didn't kill that woman, who did? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The same men who made sure he hung before he could prove his innocence. The same men who made sure your mother lost her land. The same men who are still running this county like their personal kingdom. Who? Judge Edward Holbrook, Marcus Blackwell, your Uncle James Hayes. The names hit her like physical blows. Holbrook, who had taken in Thomas only to mistreat him. Blackwell, who had tried to sell her to the highest bidder. And Uncle James, who had claimed she owed her mother's debts and delivered her to Blackwell's auction block. Why, Graham? The question encompassed everything: her father's death, her mother's suffering, Thomas's abandonment, her own fate. Land, Nathaniel said simply. Your father's land. 5,000 acres of the best grazing territory in the The territory. Water rights to the North Fork of the Laramie River. When he died, it should have gone to your mother. When she died, to you and your sister. With both of you gone. He shrugged. Your uncle inherits. He's been working with Holbrook for years. Eleanor sank into a chair, the enormity of it crashing down on her. Her entire life, the poverty after her father's death. Her mother's declining health, her sister leaving to marry a man she barely knew. All of it engineered to rob them of their birthright. How do you know all this? She asked finally. I've been watching them for a long time. Something dark flashed in Nathaniel's eyes. After your father was hanged, I made it my business to know what they did, who they hurt. Before Eleanor could respond, the door burst open and Thomas ran in, face flushed with excitement. Aunt Eleanor, Mr. Warren says I can help brush down the horses if you say it's okay. The eager hope in his voice pulled Eleanor back from the edge of her rage and grief. This child, this miraculous connection to her lost sister, needed her present, not lost in the past. That sounds fine, she managed, forcing a smile. Just be careful. As Thomas raced back outside, Nathaniel watched her carefully. He's been asking about you since he came to me. Said his mother told him stories about her brave sister. Eleanor laughed bitterly. Brave, I ended up on an auction block. You survived, Nathaniel countered. That takes courage. He moved to the door, then paused, looking back at her. There's a dress in the chest by the bed. It belonged to a woman I helped last year. Said she didn't want it anymore, too many memories. It might fit you. With that, he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with questions multiplying like storm clouds. Later that afternoon, Eleanor stood before the small mirror hanging on the cabin wall, barely recognizing herself. The dress Nathaniel had mentioned was simple blue cotton, serviceable rather than fashionable, but clean and free of memories. She had washed her face and hands in the basin, combed her hair with borrowed comb, and now looked more like herself than she had in months. Outside, she could hear Thomas's excited chatter as Nathaniel taught him to saddle a horse. The boy had taken to Nathaniel with a trust that surprised her given what she now knew about his time with Judge Holbrook. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot as she moved away from the mirror, drawing her attention to the construction of the cabin. It was well-built, solid against Wyoming's harsh elements. Not the work of a man planning to move on soon. Eleanor knelt and ran her fingers over the suspicious board. It lifted easily, revealing a small space beneath. Inside lay a leather-bound journal. She hesitated only briefly before removing it. If Nathaniel Warren knew her family's secrets, perhaps it was time she learned some of his. The journal was filled with neat, precise handwriting. Names, dates, locations, dozens of them spanning years. Women's names, children's names, each followed by brief notes, safe in Denver. Married in Santa Fe. Teaching school in Laramie. With growing astonishment, Eleanor realized she was reading a record of people Nathaniel had helped, people like her, rescued from auctions, abuse of homes, desperate situations. Near the back of the journal, she found a letter pressed between the pages. The handwriting made her heart stop, her mother's distinctive script, the loops and whirls as familiar as her own face. Miss Warren, I write to you on the recommendation of Mrs. Abigail Parker, who says you helped her daughter leave an impossible situation last spring. I find myself in need of similar assistance, though not for myself. My daughter Eleanor remains with me, but I fear what will become of her when I am gone, which the doctor assures me will be soon. My brother-in-law James has made his intentions clear. The debts he claims we owe are fabrications designed to gain control of what remains of my husband's land. If you can please find Eleanor after I am gone. She is strong, but even the strongest need allies in this world. She has her father's eyes and her own fierce heart. I cannot pay you, but I am told you do not work for money. If you have a conscience that needs easing, consider this: my husband tried to help a boy once, at great cost to himself. Perhaps helping my daughter might balance that ledger. With hope, despite everything, Margaret Hayes Eleanor's hands trembled so badly the letter shook. Her mother had known she was dying, had planned for Eleanor's protection, had reached out to this stranger based on nothing more than desperate hope. She was a remarkable woman. Eleanor looked up to find Nathaniel in the doorway watching her with those steady eyes. She didn't apologize for the intrusion, couldn't find it in herself to regret learning the truth. You've been looking for me for 3 years, she said instead. He nodded once. Your mother died a week after writing that letter. By the time I received it and made it to Green River, you'd already been taken to your uncle's house. Then you disappeared. He sent me to work for Mrs. Garfield in Laramie. Said I needed to learn a trade to pay off the debts. There were no debts, Nathaniel said flatly. Your father left your mother provided for. The ranch was profitable. The mortgage paid. Eleanor carefully refolded the letter. Then why did we live in near poverty after he died? Why did my mother take in sewing until her fingers bled? Because your Uncle James falsified documents, claimed Benjamin had taken loans against the property. As executor of the estate, he controlled everything. And no one questioned this, anger colored her voice now. The only people who might have were either dead like your father or dependent on James's goodwill like your mother. Nathaniel's voice remained even, but his eyes had darkened. Men like Holbrook Blackwell and your uncle have spent decades building their power in this region. They own judges, sheriffs, bankers. Not you, Eleanor observed. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No, not me. The sound of Thomas calling from outside broke the moment. Nathaniel straightened. He wants to show you the horses. Eleanor replaced the journal and letter, then covered the hiding spot with the floorboard. As she rose, a question formed on her lips. The coin in the box. What does it mean? Nathaniel's expression closed like a shutter. A reminder. Of what? My purchase price. With that, he turned and walked outside, leaving Eleanor to follow or not as she chose. The storm returned that evening, wind howling around the cabin's eaves like a living thing. Thomas sat at the table struggling through a reading lesson from one of Nathaniel's books while Eleanor mended a tear in the boy's jacket. Nathaniel had gone to check the livestock, ensuring the animals were secure against the worsening weather. When the door finally opened, admitting a gust of cold air and rain, he looked like a creature born of the storm itself, coat slick with water, hat brim dripping. Animals are settled, he announced, hanging his wet things by the door. Storm's getting worse, might last through tomorrow. Thomas looked up from his book. Does that mean no fishing? Afraid so, partner. Nathaniel ruffled the boy's hair as he passed. But it means extra time for reading. The casual affection between them struck Eleanor anew. In the short time she'd been here, she'd observed how Nathaniel treated Thomas with patience, respect, and genuine care. Not as a burden or an obligation, but as a person worth his time and attention. I finished the page, Thomas announced proudly. Even the big words. Well done, Nathaniel said, the praise simple but sincere. Your aunt might have a story for you before bed if you ask nicely. Thomas turned hopeful eyes to Eleanor. Would you, Aunt Eleanor? A princess story like you used to tell Mom? Eleanor set aside her mending. I think I remember a few. As Thomas settled beside her on the bench, Eleanor began weaving a tale about a princess locked in a tower not by a dragon, but by her own fear. Gradually, the princess learned that the door had never been locked, that she could have walked free at any time. But why was she scared to leave? Thomas interrupted. Eleanor glanced at Nathaniel, who had taken a seat by the fire, whittling what appeared to be a small wooden horse. Because sometimes, she said carefully, when you've been trapped for a long time, freedom becomes the scariest thing of all. Thomas considered this with the solemnity only children can muster. Like how I was scared to leave Judge Holbrook's house, even though he was mean. Eleanor's heart twisted. Yes, exactly like that. But you were very brave and did leave. Mr. Warren helped, Thomas said, shooting a look of pure adoration at Nathaniel. He said sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right anyway. Nathaniel didn't look up from his carving, but Eleanor saw his hands pause briefly at the boy's words. By the time Eleanor finished the story with the princess, not only escaping, but teaching other trapped people how to find their courage. Thomas was yawning, eyes heavy. Time for bed, I think, Nathaniel said, setting aside his carving. Thomas didn't protest, but he looked at Eleanor hesitantly. Will you be here tomorrow? The naked vulnerability in the question pierced her. This child had already lost so much: his mother, his security, any semblance of stability. Now he feared losing her too. Yes, she promised, surprising herself with how much she meant it. I'll be here tomorrow. Satisfied, Thomas allowed himself to be tucked into the trundle bed. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep, leaving Eleanor and Nathaniel alone with the storm and the crackling fire. He trusts you, Eleanor observed, keeping her voice low. Nathaniel returned to his chair, picking up the half-finished carving. Children are better judges of character than most give them credit for. And what character has he judged me to have? His eyes met hers across the room. Someone worth waiting for. The simple statement hung between them, loaded with meaning Eleanor wasn't ready to examine. Instead, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she'd read her mother's letter. What did my father do that cost him so much? My mother wrote that he tried to help a boy. Nathaniel's hands stilled. For a long moment he stared into the fire, his profile sharp against the dancing light. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if coming from somewhere far deeper than memory. I was 14. Henry Warren, the man who bought me, had a beef with a neighboring rancher named Miller. Claimed Miller's cattle were grazing on Warren land. Things got heated. He resumed his carving, the knife moving in smooth, controlled strokes. One night, Miller's wife came to our ranch looking for her husband. Said he'd ridden over to talk to Warren and never returned. Your father was foreman by then. He told her he hadn't seen Miller, but he'd help her look. Eleanor watched Nathaniel's face, seeing the shadows of the boy he'd been beneath the man's composed exterior. They found Miller's body in a ravine on the north section, shot in the back. Nathaniel's voice remained steady, but his knuckles whitened around the knife handle. Warren claimed Miller had tried to steal cattle, said it was self-defense. But your father knew better. He'd seen Warren cleaning his rifle that morning, heard him boasting he'd take care of the Miller problem once and for all. My father testified against his employer, Eleanor guessed. Nathaniel nodded once. He was the only one brave enough, or foolish enough, depending on how you look at it. The case went before Judge Holbrook, who happened to be Warren's brother-in-law. And my father was convicted instead. Eleanor finished, the pieces falling into terrible place. Warren claimed your father had argued with Miller the previous day, produced witnesses who swore they'd heard Benjamin threaten him. A ranch hand found the murder weapon hidden in your father's quarters. Nathaniel's mouth twisted bitterly. The trial lasted half a day. The hanging was carried out within the week. And you, Eleanor pressed, where were you in all this? Nathaniel's eyes finally rose to meet hers. Standing in the crowd, watching the only man who'd ever shown me kindness die for a crime he didn't commit. The weight of this shared history settled between them, a connection neither had chosen, but both were bound by. Is Henry Warren still alive? Eleanor asked. No, died of a heart attack 10 years ago. Something flickered in Nathaniel's expression. I was in prison when it happened. Eleanor blinked in surprise. Prison. Nathaniel set down his carving and knife. With deliberate movements, he unbuttoned his left cuff and rolled up his sleeve, revealing a band of scarred tissue encircling his wrist, the unmistakable mark of iron shackles worn too long. After your father died, I ran away. Spent years becoming the kind of man who could fight back against people like Warren and Holbrook. His voice remained level, but something dangerous lurked beneath the calm surface. I wasn't particular about methods. Robbed stagecoaches carrying mine payrolls, rustled cattle from big operations, burned a warehouse full of goods belonging to a man who'd beaten his Chinese workers to death. Eleanor stared at the scar, trying to reconcile this revelation with the quiet, controlled man before her. How long were you imprisoned? 5 years, territorial prison in Laramie. He rolled his sleeve down, rebuttoning the cuff with precise movements. Would have been longer, but a man there taught me something I needed to learn. What was that? That revenge consumes everything, including the one seeking it. Nathaniel's eyes held hers. That justice and vengeance aren't the same thing. Thunder crashed outside, rattling the window panes. In the trundle bed, Thomas stirred but didn't wake. Is that why you help people now? Eleanor asked. Redemption. I help people because no one helped me when I needed it. The simplicity of his answer struck her. Except your father once, and that wasn't enough to save either of us. Eleanor considered all she'd learned about her family, about Nathaniel, about the corrupt men who had shaped both their lives from the shadows. A resolve began to form, hardening like steel in a forge. These men, Holbrook, Blackwell, my uncle, they're still hurting people, still taking what isn't theirs. Nathaniel nodded once. Then they need to be stopped, she said firmly. Careful, Eleanor. His use of her first name sent an unexpected shiver through her. Thoughts like that put your father in an unmarked grave. And hiding kept my mother in poverty and put me on an auction block, she countered. I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. Something like approval flickered in his eyes. What would you propose? Eleanor glanced at Thomas's sleeping form, then back to Nathaniel. First, I need to know everything. Every connection, every scheme, every weakness these men have. Then, she straightened her shoulders, then we make them pay. Not with blood, but with truth. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, the firelight casting half his face in shadow. Then almost imperceptibly he nodded. Truth, he echoed. It might just be enough. Outside the storm raged on, but within the cabin something had shifted. A partnership formed in the quiet space between vengeance and surrender, a third path neither had walked before. Eleanor Hayes had entered this cabin as merchandise to be claimed. Now she sat across from Nathaniel Warren as an equal plotting justice against those who had stolen both their lives. And for the first time since her mother died, she felt the ember of hope rekindling in her chest. Morning arrived with tentative sunlight filtering through the cabin windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world of glistening pine needles and mud-slick paths. Eleanor stood on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee, warming her hands, watching as Nathaniel showed Thomas how to repair a hole in the chicken coop. 3 days had passed since the auction. 3 days of cautious adjustment to this unexpected sanctuary. 3 days of learning the rhythms of Nathaniel's quiet life and Thomas's eager questions. 3 days of waiting for the other boot to drop, for demands to be made, for the fragile peace to shatter. But Nathaniel had asked for nothing. He'd simply continued his daily routines, carving out space for Eleanor and Thomas as if they had always belonged there. Keep the nails straight, Nathaniel instructed, guiding Thomas's small hands on the hammer. That's it. Not too hard, just firm. Thomas's face scrunched in concentration as he drove the nail into the wooden slat. When it went in clean, he beamed with pride. I did it. You're a natural, Nathaniel said, the praise simple but genuine. 2 more and we're done. Eleanor sipped her coffee, struck by how comfortable Thomas had become with Nathaniel. The boy who had been so withdrawn when she first met him now chattered freely, asking endless questions that Nathaniel answered with infinite patience. Last night she'd overheard them talking after Thomas's reading lesson. The boy had asked why some men were mean like Judge Holbrook. Some folks forget they were once small themselves, Nathaniel had answered. They think being big means they can make others feel small. But real strength isn't about power over others, it's about standing beside them. It was the kind of answer that revealed the measure of the man, not the outlaw he'd once been, but the person he'd chosen to become. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted Eleanor's thoughts. She tensed, hand tightening around her cup, as a rider appeared on the ridge path. Nathaniel straightened immediately, one hand moving to the knife at his belt. Thomas, he said quietly, go inside and find Eleanor's sewing basket. Tell her I need more blue thread. The boy looked confused but obeyed, running past Eleanor with a worried glance at the approaching rider. Stay on the porch, Nathaniel told Eleanor, his voice low but firm. If I touch my hat brim, take Thomas and go out the back. There's a rifle under the porch steps. Before she could respond, he stepped forward to meet the rider, his posture relaxed but alert. The man who reined in his horse before the cabin was middle-aged and weather-beaten, with a star pinned to his vest, the local sheriff. His eyes narrowed as he took in Nathaniel's stance. Warren, wow, he greeted, not dismounting. Been a while. Sheriff Cooper. Nathaniel's voice betrayed nothing. What brings you out this way? Cooper's gaze shifted to Eleanor, lingering on her face. Heard you attended Blackwell's auction the other day. Came away with more than supplies. Eleanor felt exposed under his scrutiny, but lifted her chin, refusing to look away. Let him see her. Let him remember her face. Miss Hayes is a guest, Nathaniel said evenly, along with her nephew. Nephew, huh? Cooper's eyebrows rose. Convenient relation. Is there something official about this visit, Sheriff? Nathaniel's tone remained cordial, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. Cooper shifted in his saddle. Judge Holbrook's mighty concerned about a boy that went missing from his care. 8 years old, dark hair. Says the child is disturbed, prone to telling tales. That's so. Nathaniel's expression gave away nothing. The judge also mentioned a woman who disappeared from an employment arrangement with James Hayes. Says she's unstable, might have taken the boy. Cooper's eyes fixed on Eleanor again. Thought I should check if you'd seen anyone fitting those descriptions. Eleanor stepped forward before Nathaniel could answer. And what would you do if you found such people, Sheriff? Return a child to a man who beats him, Force a woman back to those who sold her. Cooper blinked, clearly surprised by her direct challenge. Ma'am, I just enforce the law. Judge Holbrook has legal guardianship of the boy, and if there are debts owed, there are no debts, Eleanor cut in. Only fabrications created to steal land that rightfully belongs to my family. The sheriff's expression hardened. Those are serious accusations against respected men. Yes, she agreed, they are. A tense silence fell. Cooper's hand rested near his holstered pistol, while Nathaniel remained perfectly still, positioned between the sheriff and the cabin where Thomas had disappeared. Finally, Cooper sighed. Look, Warren, I've got no quarrel with you. You've kept your nose clean since you got out. But Judge Holbrook isn't someone to cross, and neither is Hayes. They're saying kidnapping may be worse. Is that a threat, Sheriff? Nathaniel asked quietly. Call it a friendly warning. Cooper gathered his reins. I didn't see anyone matching those descriptions today, but Holbrook won't stop looking, and next time it might not be me who comes asking. With a touch of his hat brim, he turned his horse and rode back down the path. Eleanor watched until he disappeared beyond the tree line, her heart hammering against her ribs. He's a good man, Nathaniel said, still watching the path, caught between bad orders and his conscience. Will he come back? Eleanor asked. Not today. Nathaniel turned to face her. But Cooper's right. Holbrook won't stop looking, and your uncle has too much at stake to let you walk free. Eleanor nodded, a cold certainty settling in her bones. Then we need to move faster. Inside the cabin, Thomas sat at the table, Eleanor's sewing basket open before him, small fingers sorting through spools of thread with exaggerated care. When they entered, his head snapped up, eyes wide with worry. I couldn't find blue thread, he said, voice small. Only brown and red. That's all right, Nathaniel assured him, ruffling the boy's hair as he passed. Brown will work fine. Thomas wasn't fooled. Was that man looking for me? Eleanor and Nathaniel exchanged glances. They had agreed not to lie to the boy, no matter how difficult the truth. Yes, Eleanor said, sitting beside him, but he's gone now and you're safe. Thomas's lower lip trembled. Judge Holbrook said if I ever ran away, he'd find me and lock me in the cellar for a week. Said no one would believe anything I said because I'm just a troublemaking orphan. Anger flashed hot in Eleanor's chest. You are not an orphan, she said firmly. You have me. And you're not a troublemaker. You're a brave boy who did what was right. But what if they come back? What if they make me go with them? Real fear shone in his eyes. Nathaniel knelt beside Thomas's chair, meeting the boy at eye level, the same gesture he'd made for Eleanor at the auction. Thomas, do you remember what I promised when you first came here? Thomas nodded solemnly, that no one would hurt me again while you were around. That's right, and I keep my promises. Nathaniel's voice carried absolute conviction. But I need you to be brave a little longer. Can you do that? I think so, Thomas whispered. Good man. Nathaniel stood exchanging a meaningful look with Eleanor. Now why don't you go check on those chickens while your aunt and I talk, make sure they're settling into their repaired home. When Thomas had gone outside, Nathaniel's expression grew grave. Cooper's visit changes things. We need to move sooner than I planned. Eleanor nodded. What do we do, Deal? First, we need to establish your legal claim to your father's land. Nathaniel moved to the desk in the corner, pulling out a rolled parchment. I've been gathering evidence for years, but with you here, we can finally act on it. He spread the document on the table, a land deed with Benjamin Hayes's name clearly marked as owner. Your father's original deed filed with the Territorial Land Office in 1870. I acquired it from county records before certain parties could make it disappear. Eleanor studied the document, her father's bold signature at the bottom, sending a pang through her heart. This proves the land was his, but how do we prove it should have passed to my mother and then to me? With this. Nathaniel produced another document from his desk drawer. Your father's will. The official copy disappeared from the probate court mysteriously, but your father was careful. He left a duplicate with a lawyer in Cheyenne, a man beyond your uncle's reach. Eleanor scanned the will, breath catching at the clear instruction, all my worldly possessions and property I leave to my beloved wife Margaret, and upon her passing to be divided equally between my daughters Eleanor and Catherine. This entire time, she whispered, we had legal claim to everything. Your uncle counted on your mother being too grief-stricken and overwhelmed to fight. Then too ill. Nathaniel's voice was gentle but firm. He manufactured debts, threatened to contest the will, made your lives so difficult that survival took precedence over justice. Eleanor thought of her mother, growing thinner and more exhausted each year, fingers bleeding from endless sewing, coughing through winters in their drafty cabin, while Uncle James lived in the main house on the property. "What do we do with these documents?" she asked Steele, entering her voice. "We file them with the territorial court in Cheyenne, not the local court. Holbrook controls that. But he doesn't have as much influence at the territorial level." Nathaniel rolled the papers carefully. "Once your claim is legally established, it becomes much harder for them to dismiss you." "And Thomas," Nathaniel's jaw tightened, "that's more complicated. Holbrook obtained guardianship legally, even if under false pretenses. We need evidence of mistreatment, and we need to establish you as his closest living relative." "The bruises on his back have almost faded," Eleanor said bitterly, "and I have no proof I'm his aunt beyond resemblance. Your sister's marriage certificate would help, and her death certificate naming Thomas as her son." Nathaniel tucked the documents away. "I know someone in Cheyenne who might be able to locate copies." A plan was taking shape, but Eleanor sensed Nathaniel was holding something back. "What aren't you telling me?" He met her gaze directly. "Going to Cheyenne means leaving the safety of this cabin. It means being seen, being vulnerable. Holbrook and your uncle will fight back hard." "I'm not afraid," Eleanor said, though the hammering of her heart belied her words. "You should be," Nathaniel replied quietly. "Fear keeps you alert, keeps you alive, but it shouldn't keep you from doing what's right." Through the window, they could see Thomas in the yard, carefully scattering feed for the chickens that clustered around his feet. The morning sun caught in his dark hair, illuminating hints of red that reminded Eleanor painfully of her sister. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow at first light." Nathaniel's eyes never left the boy outside. "The sooner we establish your legal standing, the safer you both will be." Eleanor nodded, a strange mix of fear and determination coursing through her. Tomorrow they would step out of this sanctuary and into the fight of their lives, for her father's land, for Thomas's safety, for justice long denied. Rain returned overnight, a gentle patter against the roof, rather than the violent storm of days before. Eleanor lay awake in the bed Nathaniel had insisted she take, listening to the rhythmic sound and the occasional soft snore from Thomas in his trundle. Across the room, Nathaniel sat in a chair by the fire, a book open in his lap, but his gaze fixed on the flames. He hadn't slept as far as Eleanor could tell, simply maintained his vigil, ready to defend them should danger come in the night. The flickering light carved shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that never fully smoothed even in repose. In moments like this, when he thought no one was watching, Eleanor could see past his careful control of the weight he carried, years of hardship etched into the corners of his eyes, the set of his shoulders. As if sensing her attention, he looked up, meeting her gaze across the dimly lit cabin. Neither spoke. Words seemed unnecessary in the quiet communion of shared purpose, shared danger. Eleanor had spent her life guarding herself against men's intentions, learning to read the hunger or cruelty or indifference in their eyes. But Nathaniel's gaze held something else entirely, a steady respect that asked nothing, demanded nothing, simply acknowledged her as she was. It was perhaps the most disarming thing about him. Finally, she whispered, "You should sleep too." His mouth quirked in the ghost of a smile. "I will, later." "You don't trust that Sheriff Cooper will keep his word?" Nathaniel's expression sobered. "Cooper's a decent man, but decent men can be pressured, and Holbrook knows how to apply pressure. Better to stay alert." Eleanor nodded, understanding. Then, gathering her courage, she asked the question that had been gnawing at her since that first day. "Why did you really help me the truth?" For a long moment, he was silent, gaze returning to the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her, despite the sleeping boy across the room. "When I was in prison, I met a man, a preacher who visited the inmates. Most of us ignored him. Some mocked him, but he kept coming back week after week." Nathaniel's fingers traced the edge of his book absently. "One day he singled me out, said he could see I was different from the others, that I had fire, not just anger." Eleanor waited, sensing he needed to tell this story at his own pace. "He gave me books, philosophy, history, poetry, said education was the key to true freedom." A faint smile touched Nathaniel's lips. I read them to prove him wrong, ended up proving myself wrong instead. How so? I'd spent years believing the only justice was what you carved out with your own hands. An eye for an eye, but the more I read, the more I understood that kind of justice just makes the whole world blind. His eyes met hers again. The preacher taught me there's a difference between justice and vengeance. Vengeance is about making yourself feel better. Justice is about making the world better. And helping women from auction blocks makes the world better, Eleanor pressed. It's a start. He closed his book, setting it aside. After I was released, I tried to find a purpose beyond hatred. Remembered how your father had shown me kindness when no one else did. Decided maybe that was the legacy worth honoring, not the rage I'd carried for so long. Eleanor absorbed this, seeing Nathaniel in a new light. Not just a man with a mysterious past, but someone who had actively chosen a different path, who had rebuilt himself from the ruins of what others had made him. "Thank you," she said simply, "for telling me, for helping us." He nodded once acknowledgement rather than acceptance of gratitude. "Try to sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." Eleanor closed her eyes, knowing he would keep watch through the night. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel truly protected, not as a possession to be guarded, but as a person worthy of safekeeping. Dawn broke gray and misty, the rain having subsided to a fine drizzle that beaded on pine needles and soaked into the earth. Eleanor helped Thomas dress warmly for the journey, packing their few belongings into a small bag Nathaniel had provided. "Will we come back here?" Thomas asked, glancing around the cabin that had become a sanctuary. "Yes," Eleanor promised, though she knew better than to make guarantees in a world as uncertain as theirs. "But first we need to go to Cheyenne to file some important papers. Papers that will keep us safe from Judge Holbrook." "That's right." She straightened his collar, heart aching at the worry in his young eyes. "And papers that prove the land your grandfather left belongs to us, not to Uncle James." Thomas nodded solemnly. "Mr. Warren says paper can be stronger than guns sometimes." "He's a wise man," Eleanor said, smiling despite her anxiety. Outside, Nathaniel was loading supplies into the wagon, his movements efficient and purposeful. He had donned his long duster coat against the damp, a well-worn hat pulled low over his brow. The revolver at his hip was no longer hidden, its presence, a stark reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. "Ready?" he asked as they emerged from the cabin. Eleanor nodded, helping Thomas up into the wagon bed, where Nathaniel had arranged blankets for comfort during the long journey. The boy settled in, clutching the wooden horse Nathaniel had carved for him. "It's about a day and a half to Cheyenne," Nathaniel explained, assisting Eleanor onto the bench seat before taking his place beside her. "We'll stop overnight at a way station I know. The owner's reliable." As the wagon pulled away from the cabin, Eleanor looked back at the small structure that had offered her the first peace she'd known in years. Part of her wished they could stay hidden away here, safe in their isolation. But she knew that true safety would only come from confronting the men who had stolen their lives. The trail wound down from the ridge through stands of pine and across small streams swollen with rain. Nathaniel guided the horses with practiced ease, alert to every sound in the forest around them. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. Around midday, as they crossed a wide meadow dotted with wildflowers, Thomas called out from the back of the wagon, "Riders coming!" Nathaniel reacted instantly, pulling the wagon to a halt and reaching for his rifle. "Get down," he instructed Eleanor. His voice calm but brooking no argument. "Stay with Thomas." Eleanor scrambled into the wagon bed, pulling Thomas close as Nathaniel stepped down rifle ready, but held low. 3 riders approached from the east, moving at a steady trot rather than the gallop of pursuit. "Trading party," Nathaniel said after a moment, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Shoshone by the looks of them. Indeed, as the riders drew closer, Eleanor could see they were Native Americans, 2 men and a woman leading pack horses laden with goods. They slowed as they neared the wagon, raising hands in peaceful greeting. Nathaniel returned the gesture, speaking a few words in what Eleanor assumed was their language. The older of the 2 men responded, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "Old friends," Nathaniel explained to Eleanor and Thomas. "They trade with settlers in the area. Let me see what news they have." The conversation that followed was brief but animated, with Nathaniel occasionally nodding or frowning at information shared. Money and goods changed hands, Nathaniel trading coffee and ammunition for dried meat and information. When the Shoshone riders continued on their way, Nathaniel returned to the wagon, his expression troubled. What is it? Eleanor asked as he climbed back onto the bench. Holbrook's men were asking questions at the trading post yesterday, offering money for information about a man traveling with a woman and child. He flicked the reins, urging the horses forward again. Word travels fast in these parts. Did your friends tell them anything? Nathaniel shook his head. They have no love for Holbrook. His mining interests have encroached on their traditional hunting grounds for years. So they warned you instead, Eleanor observed. We've had an understanding for a long time. Nathaniel's eyes scanned the horizon continuously as they traveled. They leave my cabin alone, I provide medical supplies and fair trades, and occasionally I help when Holbrook's men get too aggressive. They traveled for several more hours, the landscape gradually changing from forested hills to more open country. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered again, threatening another downpour. Way station's just ahead, Nathaniel said, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. We'll stop there for the night. The station consisted of a main building, a stable, and several smaller outbuildings. A sign reading Pearson's Rest swung in the rising wind as they approached. An older man emerged from the main building as they pulled up, rifle in hand, but held casually. His weathered face broke into a smile of recognition when he saw Nathaniel. Warren, been a while since you graced my humble establishment. His sharp eyes took in Eleanor and Thomas. I see you've got company these days. Pearson, Nathaniel greeted, jumping down from the wagon. This is Eleanor Hayes and her nephew Thomas. We're headed to Cheyenne on business. Understanding passed between the men, Pearson clearly recognizing there was more to the story than Nathaniel was saying. Well, any friends of Warren's are welcome here, Pearson declared, gesturing toward the main building. Got stew on the stove and clean beds upstairs. No other guests tonight, so you'll have the place to yourselves. Any visitors recently? Nathaniel asked casually as he helped Eleanor down. Pearson's expression tightened slightly. Had some of Judge Holbrook's boys through yesterday, asking questions I didn't have answers to. Appreciate that, Nathaniel said quietly. Pearson nodded. World's got enough bullies without me helping them. He turned his attention to Thomas, who was climbing down from the wagon. Young man, I've got fresh-baked cookies in the kitchen if your aunt says it's all right. Thomas looked to Eleanor with hopeful eyes, and she nodded, grateful for the kindness shown to the boy. Thank you, Mr. Pearson. Just Pearson, ma'am. Everyone calls me that, even my wife, God rest her soul. He led Thomas toward the building, chatting amicably about the rabbits that lived near the stable and how they sometimes came for carrot ends if you were patient. Nathaniel began unloading their supplies, and Eleanor moved to help him. As they worked side by side, she observed the easy familiarity between Nathaniel and Pearson. He knows what you do, she said quietly, helping people like me. Nathaniel nodded, handing her a bag of provisions. Pearson's been a waypoint for years. His station is the last stop before the mountains for folks headed west, and sometimes the last chance for those needing to disappear. He seems like a good man. One of the best, Nathaniel agreed. Lost his wife to smallpox 15 years back. Could have become bitter, but instead he turned his grief into purpose. Helps people who need it, asks no questions. Inside, the way station was simple but clean, with a large common room centered around a stone fireplace. A cooking area occupied one corner where Pearson was showing Thomas how to stir the stew without splashing. Got 2 rooms upstairs, Pearson told them as they entered. One for the lady and boy, one for you, Warren. Washrooms out back if you want to clean up before supper. Eleanor gratefully accepted the opportunity to wash away the dust of travel. The washroom was basic, just a pump basin and mirror, but the cold water revived her spirits. When she returned to the main room, she found Thomas already seated at the table, enjoying a large bowl of rabbit stew, while Pearson regaled him with stories of the early days of the territory. Nathaniel sat nearby, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the boy with the hint of a smile. When he caught Eleanor's eye, something passed between them, a shared moment of appreciation for this small pocket of normalcy in their uncertain journey. Dinner was a relaxed affair, with Pearson proving to be an engaging host, full of tales from his 40 years in Wyoming. Eleanor noticed how carefully he avoided asking direct questions about their circumstances, focusing instead on making Thomas laugh with stories of clever foxes outsmarting hunters and the time a bear had wandered into his kitchen looking for honey. After the meal, Thomas's eyelids grew heavy. Eleanor took him upstairs to the room they would share, tucking him into the small bed by the window. Aunt Eleanor, he murmured sleepily, Are we going to have a home again? A real one? The question caught her off guard. Yes, she promised after a moment. We will. With Mr. Warren, Eleanor smoothed his hair back from his forehead. Would you like that? Thomas nodded, eyes already closing. He makes things safe. Yes, she whispered. He does. When she was certain Thomas was asleep, Eleanor returned downstairs to find Nathaniel and Pearson speaking in low voices by the fire. They fell silent as she approached, but Pearson's expression was grave. Everything all right? She asked. Ryder came through while you were upstairs, Pearson explained. One of my regular couriers from Laramie says Judge Holbrook has put out official warrants for Warren here, charging him with kidnapping and interference with legal custody of the boy. Cold dread settled in Eleanor's stomach. And me? Your name too, accused of abandoning legal obligations and debts, plus conspiracy with Warren. Pearson's kind eyes held sympathy. They're serious charges, miss. The kind that could mean prison. Eleanor looked to Nathaniel, who stood with his back to the fireface, half in shadow. This changes our plans. Makes them more urgent, he replied. With official warrants, every lawman in the territory will be looking for us. We need to file your claim in Cheyenne immediately, then find somewhere safe until the legal process plays out. I know people in South Pass City, Pearson offered. Good folks who mind their own business and don't ask questions. They could put you up for a spell. Nathaniel nodded gratefully. We may take you up on that. For now, we should rest. We'll need to leave before dawn. Eleanor's mind raced with this new information. Not only were Holbrook and her uncle hunting them, but now they had the law on their side. The enormity of what they faced threatened to overwhelm her. As if sensing her distress, Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice pitched for her ears alone. One step at a time, Eleanor. First Cheyenne, then we reassess. She nodded, drawing strength from his steadiness. One step at a time. Pearson discreetly busied himself banking the fire, giving them a moment of privacy. Will you come up soon? Eleanor asked Nathaniel. You need rest too. Shortly, he promised. I want to check the horses first. She knew he would likely spend most of the night on watch as he had at the cabin, always vigilant, always prepared for danger. The weight of what he risked for them, prison again or worse, struck her anew. Thank you, she said, simply, the words inadequate for all they encompassed. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. Get some rest, Eleanor. Tomorrow will be challenging enough. Upstairs, she checked on Thomas, who slept peacefully, one hand curled around the wooden horse. Eleanor sat on the edge of her own bed, mind too full for sleep despite her exhaustion. Through the window, she could see Nathaniel moving about the stable, checking each stall, securing doors. A solitary figure outlined against the lantern-light shoulders, straight despite the burdens he carried. Eleanor thought of all he had shared his past as Henry Warren's purchased boy, his years seeking vengeance, his transformation in prison, his quiet mission to help others escape similar fates, and now risking everything to help her and Thomas. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider what might lie beyond this immediate crisis. If they secured her inheritance, if Thomas was legally placed in her care, if they survived the wrath of Holbrook and her uncle, what then? The question Thomas had asked echoed in her mind. Would they have a home with Nathaniel? She had no answer yet, could barely imagine a future beyond the next desperate days. But something had taken root in her heart, a tentative hope for possibilities she had never before allowed herself to contemplate. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the distant sounds of Nathaniel's movements in the stable lull her toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. For now, she would rest in the knowledge that she was not fighting alone. They departed Pearson's station in the gray hour before dawn, when the world held its breath between night and day. Pearson provided fresh supplies and information about patrols on the road to Cheyenne. His farewell was brief but heartfelt, a firm handshake for Nathaniel and a gentle pat on Thomas's head. Travel safe, he told them, and remember my friends in South Pass if you need somewhere to lie low. The early start gave them an advantage, allowing several hours of travel before most people would be on the roads. Nathaniel chose less traveled routes, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Holbrook's men or lawmen might be watching. Thomas dozed in the wagon bed, wrapped in blankets, against the morning chill. Eleanor sat beside Nathaniel on the bench, watching the landscape transform as dawn painted the sky in delicate pinks and golds. What happens in Cheyenne? She asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. I have a contact at the Territorial Land Office, A clerk named Matthews who hates corruption more than he fears men like Holbrook. Nathaniel kept his eyes on the trail ahead as he spoke. He'll help us file your claim officially and backdate it if necessary. And Thomas, that's more complicated. We need to establish your relationship to him and prove mistreatment by Holbrook. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The bruises have faded, but Thomas's testimony might sway a sympathetic judge. Might. Children aren't always considered reliable witnesses, he admitted. But coupled with your testimony as his aunt and documentation of your sister's marriage and death, we have a chance. Eleanor nodded, understanding the precarious nature of their position. Without wealth or influence, justice was never guaranteed. There's something else we should consider, Nathaniel added after a moment, something that might strengthen both claims. And what's that? He seemed to choose his words carefully. In the eyes of the law, a married woman with a husband to speak for her interests has more standing than a single woman alone. Eleanor stiffened, memories of the auction block flashing through her mind. I will not be owned. I'm not suggesting ownership, Nathaniel said quietly. I'm suggesting a legal arrangement that would protect both you and Thomas. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. She studied his profile, noting the careful neutrality of his expression. You would do that, tie yourself legally to someone you barely know. I know enough, he replied simply. I know you're brave and determined. I know you love Thomas. I know you deserve justice. Eleanor looked away, conflicted emotions churning within her. The practical wisdom of his suggestion was undeniable. As a married woman, her claim to her inheritance would be taken more seriously, and a court would be more likely to grant guardianship of Thomas to a couple than to a single woman alone. But marriage, even one in name only, was a step she had never imagined taking willingly. You wouldn't... She hesitated, unsure how to phrase her concern. I meant what I said the first day. Nathaniel answered her unspoken question. I won't touch what isn't offered. A legal arrangement changes nothing in that regard. The sincerity in his voice reassured her. This wasn't about possession or control. It was about protection, using the very laws that had oppressed her to shield her instead. I'll consider it, she said finally, but let's see what happens in Cheyenne first. Nathaniel nodded, accepting her caution. Fair enough. They traveled steadily through the morning, stopping briefly at midday to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of bread and dried meat. Thomas had awakened and now sat between them on the bench, asking endless questions about the birds they saw and the distant mountains still capped with snow despite the advancing spring. Nathaniel answered each query with patience, occasionally testing Thomas's knowledge or challenging him to identify animal tracks or plant types. Eleanor marveled at the easy rapport between them, how naturally Nathaniel had assumed the role of teacher and protector to the boy. As they approached a crossroads, Nathaniel suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt, his posture alert. What is it? Eleanor asked, instantly tense. Dust on the south road, he replied, pointing to a distant cloud rising from the earth. Could be nothing. Could be trouble. Thomas pressed closer to Eleanor, sensing the change in atmosphere. Nathaniel handed Eleanor the reins and reached for his spyglass, extending it to study the approaching riders. 4 men, he reported after a moment, armed, moving fast. He collapsed the spyglass with a snap. We need to leave the road. Without waiting for a response, he took back the reins and turned the wagon sharply west toward a stand of cottonwoods that lined a shallow creek. The wagon bounced over the uneven ground, Thomas clinging to Eleanor's arm for stability. Are they looking for us? She asked as they reached the shelter of the trees. Can't say for certain, but I'm not inclined to find out. Nathaniel guided the wagon deep into the grove where the canopy overhead would hide them from distant eyes. We'll wait here until they pass. He helped Eleanor and Thomas down, then moved to calm the horses, speaking in low, soothing tones. Eleanor led Thomas to a fallen log where they could sit, the boy's hand tight in hers. Are those bad men? Thomas whispered. We don't know, she answered honestly, but Mr. Warren is being careful just in case. Nathaniel returned, rifle in hand, though held casually. They're on the main road to Cheyenne. If they continue straight, they'll pass without seeing us. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited, listening. The distant sound of hoofbeats and men's voices reached them, then began to fade as the riders continued down the main road. Eleanor had just begun to relax when Nathaniel tensed, raising a hand for silence. A single set of hoofbeats approached their hiding place, slower, more deliberate. Someone broke off from the main group, he murmured. Stay here. Don't move. Before Eleanor could protest, he had melted into the underbrush, moving with the silent grace of a predator. Thomas pressed against her side, trembling slightly, but making no sound. Through the trees, Eleanor glimpsed a rider, a broad-shouldered man with a rifle across his saddle, scanning the woods with narrowed eyes. He rode slowly along the creek, clearly searching for something or someone. The man reined in his horse not 30 yards from where Eleanor and Thomas sat frozen. He dismounted, examining the ground where their wagon had left tracks entering the trees. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the man would hear it. Thomas buried his face against her arm, too frightened to look. The man followed their trail for several steps, then paused, head tilting, as if listening. He reached for the rifle on his saddle. In that moment, Nathaniel appeared behind him, moving with deadly silence. Before the man could turn, Nathaniel had a knife at his throat and a hand over his mouth. Make a sound, and it's your last, Nathaniel said, voice barely carrying to where Eleanor watched with wide eyes. Nod if you understand. The man nodded, rigid with fear. You're one of Holbrook's men, Nathaniel continued. It wasn't a question. Looking for a woman and boy traveling with me. Another nod. Here's what happens now. I'm going to let you go, and you're going to ride back to your friends. You'll tell them you found nothing. Just tracks from a hunter heading west. Do otherwise, and I'll find you. Nathaniel's voice remained calm, conversational, almost which somehow made the threat more terrifying. I know where Holbrook keeps his payroll. I know which saloon you favor in Laramie. I know about the red-haired woman you visit on Tuesdays. The man's eyes widened. Do we understand each other? A frantic nod. Good. Nathaniel lowered the knife but maintained his grip on the man's collar. One more thing. Whatever Holbrook's paying you, it's not worth dying for. Remember that. He released the man, who stumbled back toward his horse, face pale. Without looking back, the rider mounted and galloped away, rejoining his companions on the main road. Nathaniel watched until they were out of sight, then returned to Eleanor and Thomas, his expression grim. Holbrook's men, he confirmed, looking specifically for us. How did they know we'd be on this road? Eleanor asked. Someone at Pearson's must have talked after we left, or they've guessed our destination. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, considering their options. Either way, we can't take the direct route to Cheyenne now. They'll have men watching at all the approaches. Thomas, who had remained silent throughout the encounter, finally spoke. Are we going back to the cabin? No, Nathaniel said gently. We still need to get to Cheyenne. We'll just take a different path. Eleanor saw the determination in his eyes, the refusal to be deterred by this setback. What do you suggest? There's a settlement about 10 miles west of here, mostly Shoshone families, and a few white traders who married into the tribe. Friends of mine. They can guide us through the backcountry to Cheyenne. Nathaniel glanced at the sky, calculating. It will add a day to our journey, but we'll avoid the main roads where Holbrook's men are watching. The delay was frustrating, but Eleanor understood the necessity. They couldn't risk capture now, not when they were so close to establishing her claim. Thomas and I will follow your lead, she said firmly. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. You're handling this remarkably well. I've had practice at two difficult circumstances, she replied with a small smile. And I have motivation. She nodded toward Thomas, who had regained some of his color now that the immediate danger had passed. Then let's continue west, Nathaniel said, helping them both to their feet. We have friends waiting and justice that won't be denied. As they returned to the wagon, Eleanor found herself studying Nathaniel with new eyes. The man who had shown such gentle patience with Thomas was the same man who had held a knife to a throat without hesitation, who knew precisely how to threaten and intimidate when necessary. Yet she wasn't afraid of him, perhaps because she understood that his capacity for violence was tempered by choice, a weapon kept sheathed unless protecting those under his care. They drove west as the afternoon sun began its descent, following the creek through stands of cottonwood and willow. Thomas's earlier chatter had subsided, replaced by watchful silence. The boy had witnessed too much in his young life, Eleanor reflected sadly. Too much fear, too much uncertainty. She made a silent promise to him and to herself. When this was over, when they had secured their safety and their future, she would build him a home where fear had no place, where he could be simply a child, not a fugitive or a pawn in powerful men's games. Whether that home would include Nathaniel remained an open question, one that grew more complex with each passing day. The wagon rolled on toward the setting sun, three fugitives bound together by circumstance and choice by justice, delayed but not forgotten by the fragile hope of a future waiting to be claimed. The Shoshone settlement appeared as the sun dipped below the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Smoke rose from several lodges arranged in a loose circle, dogs barking to announce their approach. Children paused in their play to watch the wagon wind down the hillside. Nathaniel raised his hand in greeting as they neared the first dwelling. An older man emerged, his weathered face breaking into a smile of recognition. "Nate," he called, approaching the wagon. "Long time no see, my friend." "Eagle Heart," Nathaniel replied warmly, jumping down to clasp the man's hand. "We need your help." Eagle Heart's eyes flickered to Eleanor and Thomas, assessing but not unfriendly. "Trouble follows you, as always, I see." "Like a faithful psh," Nathaniel agreed with a wry smile. "This is Eleanor Hayes and her nephew Thomas. We're trying to reach Cheyenne, but Holbrook's men are watching the roads." At the mention of Holbrook, Eagle Heart's expression hardened. That man, always taking, never giving. He nodded decisively. "You will stay tonight. Tomorrow, my son, Two Rivers will guide you through the mountain pass. No white men go that way." Relief washed over Eleanor. Another night of safety before continuing their dangerous journey. Eagle Heart led them to a lodge at the edge of the settlement, larger than most and set slightly apart. "My daughter Rising Moon's home," he explained. "Her husband died last winter. She has space and welcomes company." A young woman appeared in the doorway, perhaps a few years younger than Eleanor, with an infant strapped to her back and quiet dignity in her bearing. She nodded at her father's introduction, then gestured for them to enter. Inside the lodge was warm and inviting, with a central fire pit and furs spread for seating. Rising Moon busied herself preparing food while her father and Nathaniel spoke in low voices near the entrance. Thomas stuck close to Eleanor, wide-eyed but curious about their surroundings. "Have you been here before?" Eleanor asked him quietly. Thomas shook his head. "Only saw Indians from far away at Judge Holbrook's. He said they were dangerous." "Judge Holbrook was wrong about many things," she replied. "These people are helping us when we need it most." Rising Moon approached with wooden bowls of stew, offering them first to her guest. As she handed one to Thomas, she smiled, the first real expression Eleanor had seen from her. "You have hungry eyes," Rising Moon said to the boy, "like my brother when he was small." Thomas accepted the bowl shyly. "Thank you, ma'am." Rising Moon's smile deepened at his politeness. She settled nearby, adjusting the sleeping infant on her back with practiced ease. "Your baby is beautiful," Eleanor offered, hoping to bridge the silence. "His name is Little Bear," Rising Moon replied, pride evident in her voice. Born as the snow began to melt. A strong time. Eleanor watched as the woman managed to eat while keeping the child secure. "May I ask how you manage alone since your husband died?" Something flickered in Rising Moon's dark eyes. Recognition of the deeper question Eleanor was really asking. How does a woman stand on her own in this unforgiving world? "I am not alone," she said, simply gesturing to the settlement beyond the lodge walls. "My family is here, my people. We carry each other's burdens." The straightforward wisdom struck Eleanor deeply. All her life she had been taught that a woman needed a man's protection to survive, first her father, then potentially a husband. When those safeguards had disappeared, she had been left vulnerable to men like her uncle and Marcus Blackwell. Yet here was Rising Moon, widowed but not broken, raising her child within a community that valued her. Across the lodge, Nathaniel and Eagle Heart concluded their conversation, the older man nodding before taking his leave. Nathaniel joined them by the fire, accepting a bowl of stew from Rising Moon with a grateful nod. "Two Rivers will guide us through the mountain pass at first light," he explained. "It's a harder trail, but we'll reach Cheyenne by tomorrow evening and no one will see us coming." "Your friend Eagle Heart seems to know you well," Eleanor observed. A hint of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. "I've known the family for many years. Traded with them, learned from them. Helped them when Holbrook's men tried to force them off this land 3 years ago." "Holbrook again," Eleanor murmured. "His reach extends everywhere. Men like him believe they can own anything, land, resources, people." Nathaniel's voice hardened. "They're wrong." Rising Moon spoke up unexpectedly. "Nate stopped the men who came with papers and guns. Said our claim predated Wyoming territory itself." Pride colored her words. "He spoke to territorial governor." made them listen. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel with new understanding. His quest for justice extended beyond helping women from auction blocks it encompassed, standing against the powerful whenever they abused their position. As the evening deepened, more of the settlement's residents stopped by Rising Moon's lodge, curious about the visitors. Most greeted Nathaniel as an old friend, bringing small gifts of food or asking his opinion on various matters. Eleanor noticed how he shifted seamlessly between cultures, showing respect for their ways while maintaining his own identity. Thomas, initially shy, soon found himself playing with several children outside the lodge language barriers, overcome by the universal rules of tag and hide and seek. His laughter, rare and precious, floated through the evening air. Later, as Thomas slept on a pallet of soft furs and Rising Moon nursed her baby by the fire, Eleanor stepped outside to find Nathaniel sitting alone, staring at the star-filled sky. "You've built a life I never would have imagined," she said softly, settling beside him on a fallen log. He glanced at her, eyebrow raised in question. A white man accepted by the Shoshone, an ex-prisoner respected by honest men like Pearson, a former outlaw who helps those in need. She shook her head slightly. "It's not the story most would expect. We're all more than our worst choices," Nathaniel replied, turning his gaze back to the stars, "and sometimes more than our best ones, too." Eleanor considered this, drawing her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "Earlier you suggested a marriage of convenience might strengthen my legal claims." He nodded, expression carefully neutral. "It would. Courts respect a husband's petition more than a woman's, especially in property matters." "I've been thinking about it," she said slowly. "About what it would mean." Nathaniel remained silent, giving her space to continue. "All my life, I've feared being owned first by my uncle, then by whoever purchased me at that auction." Eleanor's fingers twisted in her shawl. "Marriage has always seemed like another form of ownership." "It can be," he acknowledged, "in the wrong hands. But not in yours." She turned to face him, fully searching his expression in the moonlight. His eyes met hers directly. "I meant what I said the first day, Eleanor. I claim nothing. I won't touch what isn't offered. A legal arrangement changes nothing in that regard. And if it's more than a legal arrangement," the question escaped before she could reconsider, hanging in the night air between them. Something shifted in Nathaniel's gaze, a carefully banked fire flickering to life. "That would be your choice, always your choice." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding the promise beneath his words. With Nathaniel, she would never be property, never be less than equal. The realization settled in her chest, warm and certain. "Then yes," she said quietly, "when we reach Cheyenne, we should marry, for Thomas's protection and my claim, and because I believe you're a good man, Nathaniel Warren." He studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing each feature. Then with deliberate care he reached for her hand. When she didn't pull away, he lifted it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'll do right by you and Thomas," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's my vow, whether spoken before a preacher or not." The simple gesture, the sincere words, they affected Eleanor more deeply than grand declarations ever could. This was a man who understood the value of choice, of consent freely given. A man who had lived through ownership and vowed never to inflict it on another. They sat together in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, their joined hands a bridge across their separate pasts toward a shared future. Dawn arrived with whispered preparations and hushed goodbyes. Two Rivers' eagle-hard son and their guide appeared as promised, already mounted on a sturdy pinto horse. He was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 20, with keen eyes and a quiet confidence. "The mountain path is narrow," he explained as they loaded their belongings into the wagon. "Wagon can follow most of the way, but last part may require walking." Nathaniel nodded, speaking briefly in the Shoshone language. Two Rivers smiled in response, then turned his horse toward the mountains rising to the east. Rising Moon approached as they prepared to depart. Little Bear, strapped to her chest. She pressed a small bundle wrapped in soft hide into Eleanor's hands. "Medicine," she explained, "for healing." And this, she removed a beaded bracelet from her wrist and tied it around Eleanor's, "for protection." Touched by the unexpected gift, Eleanor clasped the woman's hand. "Thank you for everything." Rising Moon's dark eyes held wisdom beyond her years. "We women must stand together. The world is hard enough." With final farewells exchanged, they set out after Two Rivers, the wagon creaking as it began the ascent into the foothills. Thomas, refreshed from a night of safety, chattered excitedly about the children he'd played with and the new words he'd learned. The trail gradually narrowed, forcing them to travel single file along rocky passages where the mountain fell away steeply on one side. Two Rivers led with confidence, occasionally stopping to point out landmarks or signs of wildlife. By midday, they had climbed high enough to look back across the valley, the Shoshone settlement now just a collection of tiny dots in the distance. Ahead, the trail twisted through a dense pine forest before emerging onto a rocky plateau. "Rest horses here," Two Rivers announced, dismounting near a small spring bubbling from the mountainside. Halfway point. While Nathaniel and Two Rivers watered the horses, Eleanor prepared a simple meal from the provisions Rising Moon had provided. Thomas explored nearby, under strict instructions not to wander out of sight. "Aunt Eleanor," he called suddenly, excitement in his voice. "Look what I found." He held up a chunk of quartz, its surface glittering in the sunlight. "Two Rivers says there's treasure in these mountains." "It's beautiful," she agreed, examining the crystal. "A fine souvenir of our journey." Thomas beamed, tucking the stone carefully into his pocket. "I'm going to start a collection in our new home, wherever that is." The casual mention of their uncertain future tugged at Eleanor's heart. This boy deserves stability, security, things she was fighting to provide. "Our new home will be wonderful," she promised, "with room for all your treasures." Nathaniel approached, carrying a water skin. "Two Rivers says we should keep moving, storm clouds gathering to the west." Indeed, dark clouds had begun to mass on the horizon, promising afternoon rain. They quickly packed up and continued along the trail, which now began to descend toward a narrow pass between twin peaks. The path grew increasingly treacherous, forcing Eleanor and Thomas to walk, while Nathaniel guided the wagon carefully over the rocky terrain. Two Rivers rode ahead, scouting the safest route. As they navigated a particularly steep section, the wagon wheel struck a boulder, cracking ominously. Nathaniel halted, immediately jumping down to examine the damage. "Wheel rim's split," he announced grimly. "It'll hold for now, but we need to move carefully." They proceeded at an even slower pace, the damaged wheel creaking protestingly with each rotation. Eleanor walked beside Thomas, one hand on his shoulder to steady him on the uneven ground. The promised storm reached them as they entered the pass, rain beginning as a gentle patter before intensifying to a steady downpour. Two Rivers led them to an overhang in the rock face, not quite a cave, but enough shelter to wait out the worst of the deluge. Huddled beneath the rocky outcrop, they watched as water cascaded down the mountainside, turning the trail they had just traversed into a muddy rivulet. "We cannot continue until rain stops," Two Rivers stated, eyeing the treacherous conditions. "Wheel will not survive." Nathaniel nodded in agreement, helping Eleanor and Thomas arrange blankets on the relatively dry ground beneath the overhang. "We'll wait it out. Still have daylight left." The forced delay chafed at Eleanor, each hour lost potentially giving Holbrook and her uncle more time to strengthen their position. Yet she understood the necessity. A broken wagon in the mountains could leave them stranded or worse. Thomas, oblivious to these concerns, saw the wait as an adventure. He pestered Two Rivers with questions about mountain lions and bears, delighted by the young man's stories of encounters with wildlife. Nathaniel used the time to better secure the damaged wheel, wrapping it with leather straps from their supplies. "Should hold until Cheyenne," he told Eleanor quietly. "But we'll need to find a wheelwright there before heading back." The casual mention of heading back caught her attention. "Back where?" she asked. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Wherever you and Thomas choose to make your home." The implication was clear. Their future remained uncertain, dependent on the outcome of their legal battle and Eleanor's choices thereafter. Even their planned marriage in Cheyenne was at its core a strategic decision rather than an emotional one. Yet as Eleanor watched Nathaniel with Thomas patiently explaining how to estimate the age of a pine tree by its rings on a fallen log, she wondered if the lines between strategy and feeling were beginning to blur. After an hour, the rain subsided to a light drizzle. Two Rivers scouted ahead, returning with news that the trail remained passable if they proceeded with caution. 6 more miles to Eastern Slope, he informed them, then wagon road to Cheyenne. They set out again, the going slower but steady. By late afternoon, they had descended from the mountains onto more level ground where a rutted road led eastward through rolling hills. "I leave you here," Two Rivers announced as they reached a fork in the road. "Follow this path, reach Cheyenne by nightfall." Nathaniel clasped the young man's arm in gratitude. "Tell your father we won't forget his help. When this is over, I'll return." Two Rivers nodded, his usually stoic expression warming slightly. Good hunting, Nate. His eyes shifted to Eleanor and Thomas. Watch over your family. With that, he turned his horse and galloped back toward the mountains, soon disappearing among the trees. Eleanor felt a strange tightness in her chest at his parting words. Your family? Was that what they were becoming? This unlikely trio bound by circumstance and shared purpose. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas asked from the wagon bed, Are we a family now, Aunt Eleanor? She glanced at Nathaniel, who kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, giving her space to answer, as she chose. We're becoming one, she said carefully. Families can be made in many ways, Thomas, not just by blood. The boy seemed satisfied with this answer, returning to his game of arranging pine cones and patterns on the wagon floor. Nathaniel guided the horses onto the road to Cheyenne, the damaged wheel holding, but protesting with each rotation. We should reach town by dusk. Best if we enter after dark, fewer eyes to notice us. Eleanor nodded, understanding the continued need for caution. Despite their remote mountain passage, Holbrook's influence extended throughout the territory. Until they had filed their legal claims and secured Thomas's guardianship, they remained vulnerable. What exactly happens in Cheyenne? She asked, voicing the question that had been building since they began this journey. First, we find my contact at the land office, Matthews. He'll help us file your claim to your father's property with the territorial court. Nathaniel's voice took on the steady rhythm of a man outlining a familiar plan. Then we visit a judge I know, Judge Carlton. He's one of the few Holbrook hasn't bought. We present your case for guardianship of Thomas. And our marriage, the word still felt strange on Eleanor's lips. Judge Carlton can perform that as well, if you're still certain. Nathaniel glanced at her, his expression giving her every opportunity to reconsider. I am, she confirmed. It's the most practical solution. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps disappointment at her emphasis on practicality, but he nodded, returning his attention to the road. They traveled in companionable silence as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The landscape opened before them, rolling plains replacing the mountain, scattered homesteads appearing with increasing frequency as they neared civilization. Cheyenne's lights appeared in the distance as dusk settled over the land, the territorial capital, a sprawl of buildings and streets much larger than Eleanor had anticipated. After days in the wilderness, the sight of so many structures, so many people was both welcome and intimidating. We'll stable the horses at the edge of town, Nathaniel decided, guiding the wagon toward a modest livery, less noticeable than driving through the main streets. The liveryman asked no questions beyond the practical matter of payment, accepting Nathaniel's coins with a disinterested nod. They gathered their essential belongings, leaving the wagon to be repaired. Matthews lives above the printer's shop on Hill Street, Nathaniel explained as they walked through the gathering darkness, Thomas between them. We'll go there first. He can direct us to safe lodging. Eleanor pulled her shawl closer, feeling exposed after days of relative isolation. Every passing stranger seemed a potential threat, every glance their way a possible recognition. Thomas sensed her tension, his small hand tightening in hers. Almost there, Nathaniel assured them, leading them down a side street where a small sign announced Cheyenne Territorial Press in faded letters. A narrow staircase at the side of the building led to a door on the second floor. Nathaniel knocked in a distinctive pattern, 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. The door opened a crack, revealing a sliver of a man's face, spectacles glinting in the dim light from within. Yes, evening Matthews, Nathaniel Warren. We spoke through Pearson. The door opened wider, revealing a thin man of middle years, ink-stained fingers, and a perpetually worried expression. Warren, wasn't sure you'd make it. Heard there's trouble on the roads. We took the scenic route, Nathaniel replied dryly. May we come in? It's been a long journey. Matthews peered past him at Eleanor and Thomas, hesitated, then nodded. Quickly then. The apartment above the print shop was cluttered but clean, every surface covered with newspapers and documents in precarious stacks. Matthews cleared space at a small table, gesturing for them to sit. Tea, he offered, already moving to put a kettle on the small stove. Thank you, Eleanor accepted gratefully, helping Thomas remove his coat. The boy's eyes were heavy with exhaustion after the long day's travel. Matthews busied himself with cups and saucers, glancing nervously at his guests. Heard about the warrants, he said finally. Kidnapping charges, serious business. Fabricated charges, Nathaniel corrected. Eleanor is Thomas's aunt and rightful guardian. We have documentation to prove it. And the land claim, Matthews asked, pouring steaming tea into mismatched cups. Benjamin Hayes's original deed and will, both establishing Eleanor as the legitimate heir. Matthews nodded, pushing his spectacles higher on his nose. Judge Holbrook won't take this lying down, nor James Hayes. They've invested years in this scheme, which is why we need to file everything officially as soon as possible, Nathaniel pressed. First thing tomorrow. Yes, yes, Matthews agreed, though anxiety pinched his features. I can help with that, but you'll need somewhere safe to stay tonight. Holbrook has eyes everywhere. We hoped you might have suggestions, Eleanor said. Matthews considered, then nodded decisively. The widow Grantham runs a boarding house on Pine Street. Very discreet. Doesn't ask questions. I'll take you there myself after you've had your tea. Thomas had begun to nod off at the table, his head drooping, despite his efforts to stay awake. Eleanor stroked his hair gently, heart aching for all he had endured. Tomorrow will change everything, she murmured, more to herself than the others. Matthews gave her a sympathetic look. For better or worse, yes. The territorial court opens at 9. We should be there when the doors open before word can spread of your arrival. Nathaniel nodded agreement, his eyes on Eleanor and Thomas. She could read the determination in his gaze, the silent promise to see this through no matter what obstacles emerged. After finishing their tea, Matthews led them through back alleys to the boarding house he had mentioned, a 3-story building set back from the street, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. The widow Grantham proved to be a formidable woman of 60, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a discretion born of long experience with lodgers who preferred anonymity. She asked no questions beyond their immediate needs, showing them to 2 adjoining rooms on the top floor. Breakfast at 7, she informed them. Backstairs lead to the kitchen garden if you need to come and go unseen. When she had gone, leaving them in the narrow hallway, Nathaniel turned to Eleanor. Try to rest. Tomorrow will require all our strength. She nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what awaited them. After days of journey of planning and preparation, the moment of confrontation was nearly upon them. Nathaniel, she said softly, Thomas already asleep in her arms, his weight growing heavier by the moment. Thank you for everything. He studied her face in the dim hallway light, something unspoken passing between them. Then with gentle deliberation, he reached out to touch her cheek, the first time he had initiated such contact. Sleep well, Eleanor, he murmured, then turned to enter his own room. Eleanor carried Thomas into their room, settling him on the narrow bed without waking him. As she prepared for sleep herself, she found her thoughts returning to Nathaniel's touch, brief, tentative, yet somehow more significant than any words could have been. Tomorrow they would face Holbrook and her uncle, armed with truth and legal documents. Tomorrow they would marry a union of convenience to strengthen their position. Tomorrow might bring victory or defeat, safety or continued danger. Yet in this quiet moment, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine beyond tomorrow, to a future where touch was freely given and received, where a family built from choice rather than blood found its place in the world. With that hopeful vision carrying her towards sleep, Eleanor Hayes closed her eyes, ready for whatever the dawn might bring. The territorial courthouse stood in the center of Cheyenne, an imposing structure of red brick and white columns that spoke of law and order in a land still finding its way towards civilization. Eleanor gazed up at it, Thomas's hand clasped firmly in hers, Nathaniel a steady presence at her side. Matthews had arrived at the boarding house before breakfast, bringing news that increased the urgency of their mission. Word's out that you're in Cheyenne, he'd informed them anxiously. Holbrook's men were asking questions at the hotels last night. Now as they climbed the courthouse steps, Eleanor felt exposed, a target in plain sight. She wore her best dress, the blue cotton Nathaniel had given her at the cabin, while Thomas had been scrubbed clean, his hair slicked down with water in an attempt at respectability. Inside the building echoed with footsteps and murmured conversations, clerks and lawyers moving purposefully through high-ceilinged corridors. Matthews led them directly to the land records office, where a harried clerk looked up from a mountain of paperwork. Matthews, the man greeted without enthusiasm. What brings the newspaper to bother me today? Filing business, Jenkins. Official records. Matthews adjusted his spectacles nervously. Need to register a deed and will with the territorial court. Jenkins sighed dramatically, but reached for the documents Matthews produced from his satchel. Names. Benjamin Hayes deceased, Eleanor Hayes heir. Matthews kept his voice low, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly as he examined the papers. Hayes, as in Hayes Ranch out by Laramie. Eleanor stepped forward. Yes, my father's property. Jenkins studied her with new interest. Thought James Hayes owned that spread now. A misunderstanding we're here to correct, Nathaniel interjected smoothly. Something in his tone must have conveyed more than his words, for Jenkins nodded hastily and began the process of recording the documents in the territorial ledger. We'll need Judge Carlton's signature to formalize, he explained as he worked. He's hearing cases in courtroom 2 this morning. Matthews nodded. We're headed there next. Need to file guardianship papers as well. He gestured discreetly to Thomas, who stood solemnly beside Eleanor. When Jenkins had finished, he handed Eleanor a receipt acknowledging the filing. Official copy will be ready by week's end. Judge's signature pending, of course. Thank you, Eleanor said, tucking the paper carefully into her reticule. This small slip represented the first step toward reclaiming her birthright, tangible evidence of her father's intentions. They proceeded to courtroom 2, where Matthews informed the bailiff they sought a private audience with Judge Carlton on urgent business. The man disappeared through a side door, returning moments later. Judge will see you in his chambers after the current case, he informed them. Wait here. The next 30 minutes stretched interminably as they sat on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom. Thomas fidgeted beside Eleanor, unused to such formal surroundings and the constraints of good behavior they required. Finally, the bailiff reappeared, gesturing for them to follow. He led them to a wood-paneled office where a distinguished man in his 60s sat behind a massive desk, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed documents. Matthews, Judge Carlton greeted, looking up. And these must be the parties you mentioned in your note. Yes, Your Honor. Eleanor Hayes, her nephew Thomas Miller, and Nathaniel Warren. Matthews performed the introductions with nervous formality. Judge Carlton studied them thoughtfully, his shrewd eyes lingering on Thomas. Sit, please. I understand there are several matters requiring my attention. For the next hour, they presented their case, the guardianship petition for Thomas, supported by documentation of his mother's marriage and death, the land claim against James Hayes backed by Benjamin Hayes's will and deed, and finally the request for a marriage license for Eleanor and Nathaniel. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or examining the provided documents more closely. When they had finished, he removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose thoughtfully. Miss Hayes, I'd like to speak with you privately, he said finally. The rest of you, please wait outside. Nathaniel looked ready to object, but Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on his arm. It's all right, she said quietly. When the others had left, Judge Carlton's formal demeanor softened slightly. Miss Hayes, I knew your father. Not well, but enough to recognize he was an honest man who didn't deserve his fate. Surprised, Eleanor leaned forward. You knew the truth about his conviction. I suspected, the judge corrected. But suspicion isn't evidence, and I was a junior judge then, with little influence against men like Holbrook. He rose, moving to the window that overlooked the courthouse square. What you're attempting is dangerous. Holbrook and your uncle have built their power over decades. They won't relinquish it easily. I understand the risk, Eleanor said firmly. But I owe this to my father, to my mother who died in poverty, to my sister who fled only to die alone, and to Thomas who deserves safety and his birthright. Judge Carlton nodded slowly. And this marriage to Warren, is it truly your wish, or merely a legal strategy? The directness of the question caught Eleanor off guard. It's complicated, she admitted. Nathaniel has helped us when no one else would. He's risked everything. The marriage would strengthen our legal position, yes, but also provide Thomas with stability. And your own feelings in the matter, the judge pressed gently. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. My feelings are still evolving, but I trust him completely. Judge Carlton seemed satisfied with this answer. Very well. I'll grant the guardianship petition provisionally pending a formal hearing next month. I'll endorse your land claim filing, which will prevent your uncle from selling or transferring the property until ownership is determined. And I'll perform your marriage ceremony today if that remains your wish. Relief washed over Eleanor like a physical wave. Thank you, Your Honor, for everything. Don't thank me yet, he cautioned. You've won a skirmish, not the war. Holbrook will fight this, and he fights dirty. As if summoned by his name, a commotion erupted in the outer office, raised voices, the sound of something crashing to the floor. Judge Carlton strode to his door, yanking it open to reveal a tableau that froze Eleanor's blood. Nathaniel stood in a defensive posture before Thomas, facing three men who had apparently forced their way past the bailiff. At their center stood Eleanor's uncle, James Hayes, a bull of a man with a florid face and cold eyes she remembered all too well. "Where is she?" James demanded, not yet seeing Eleanor behind the judge. "Where's my niece and the boy she kidnapped?" Judge Carlton drew himself up to his full height, impressive despite his age. "This is my chambers, Mr. Hayes, and you are interrupting official court business. I suggest you remove yourself before I have you arrested for contempt." James faltered slightly at the authoritative tone, but didn't retreat. "With respect, Your Honors, I'm pursuing fugitives. My niece Eleanor Hayes absconded from her legal obligations and took a ward of Judge Holbrook's without permission. This man," he jabbed a finger toward Nathaniel, "aided and abetted her crimes." "Interesting allegations," Judge Carlton replied coldly, "especially considering I've just reviewed documentation proving Miss Hayes is the boy's legitimate guardian and rightful heir to property you've been managing rather creatively." James's face darkened to a dangerous purple. "Lies and forgeries. Eleanor is mentally unstable, Your Honor. Has been since her mother died. These men have taken advantage of her condition to manufacture false claims." Eleanor stepped forward, unable to remain silent in the face of such blatant lies. "The only false claims here are yours, uncle. False debts, false reports to Judge Holbrook about Thomas, false statements about my father's property." James's eyes widened at the sight of her, momentarily speechless. Eleanor used his surprise to move to Nathaniel's side, placing a protective hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Miss Hayes has filed her father's original will and deed with the territorial court," Judge Carlton stated. "Documents that clearly establish her inheritance. I've endorsed that filing." "This isn't over," James sputtered, regaining his voice. Judge Holbrook's authority doesn't supersede territorial law," Carlton cut in sharply. "Now I suggest you take your concerns through proper legal channels, starting with the exit from my chambers." For a tense moment, Eleanor thought her uncle might resort to violence. His hands clenched into fists, his entire body vibrating with thwarted rage. But the bailiff had returned with reinforcements, and even James Hayes recognized the futility of physically challenging a judge in his own courthouse. "This isn't over," he repeated, his gaze boring into Eleanor with naked hatred. "Not by a long shot." With that, he stormed out, his companions following in his wake. The sudden silence felt as tangible as the tension that had preceded it. Judge Carlton sighed heavily. "Well, that accelerates our timetable. Hayes will go straight to Holbrook, and they'll begin legal countermeasures immediately." Nathaniel nodded grimly. "Which is why we should complete the marriage and guardianship proceedings now while we can." "Agreed." The judge returned to his desk, retrieving the necessary forms. "We'll need witnesses. Matthews can serve as one. Bailiff can be the other." The next hour passed in a blur for Eleanor. The simple ceremony conducted in Judge Carlton's chambers bore little resemblance to the wedding she might once have imagined as a young girl. There were no flowers, no music, no finery, just solemn vows exchanged before a judge with Thomas and Matthews as witnesses. Yet when Nathaniel took her hands in his, speaking the traditional promises with quiet sincerity, Eleanor felt something shift within her, a recognition that this union, begun as strategy, had already become something more. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Carlton declared, signing the marriage certificate with a flourish. "May your union bring you strength for the battles ahead." Nathaniel's eyes held Eleanor's, a question in their depths. She answered by rising on tiptoe to press a gentle kiss to his cheek, their first physical affirmation of their new relationship. The guardianship papers were signed next, officially recognizing Eleanor as Thomas's legal guardian, with Nathaniel as co-guardian by virtue of their marriage. The boy watched the proceedings with solemn attention, understanding in some fundamental way that his future was being secured, stroke by stroke of the judge's pen. "These documents establish your legal standing," Judge Carlton explained when the formalities were complete. "But they don't guarantee your safety. Hayes and Holbrook still have considerable influence in this territory." "What would you suggest, Your Honor?" Nathaniel asked. The judge considered carefully. "Leave Cheyenne today. Don't return to the boarding house. Hayes will look there first. Mosham. Find somewhere secure to stay until the territorial court convenes next month for the formal hearing on your land claim." South Pass City, Eleanor suggested, remembering Pearson's recommendation. We have friends there. Nathaniel nodded agreement. Remote enough to be safe, close enough to return when needed. A wise choice, Judge Carlton approved. I'll ensure all communications go through Matthews to minimize the risk of interception. As they prepared to leave, the judge pulled Nathaniel aside for a private word. Eleanor couldn't hear what was said, but Nathaniel's expression grew increasingly grave as he listened. Outside the courthouse, Matthews bid them farewell, promising to forward any legal notices to South Pass City through secure channels. Be careful, he urged, glancing nervously at the street around them. Hayes wasn't bluffing about Holbrook's reaction. With the clerk's departure, Nathaniel led Eleanor and Thomas through a series of back streets, moving with purpose toward the edge of town. What did Judge Carlton tell you? Eleanor asked quietly as they walked Thomas between them. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Holbrook has more at stake in this than we realized. Your father's land doesn't just represent grazing rights. There's a railroad survey proposing a new line through that property, one that would make the owner extremely wealthy. So it's not just about stealing our inheritance, Eleanor realized. It's about positioning for the railroad. Exactly. Which means Holbrook won't limit himself to legal challenges. Nathaniel's voice dropped further. The judge believes he'll resort to more permanent solutions if the law doesn't serve his purpose. The implication sent a chill through Eleanor. He'd kill for this. He already has, Nathaniel reminded her grimly. Your father wasn't his first victim, nor his last. They reached the livery where they had left their wagon the previous evening. The damaged wheel had been repaired, the horses fed and rested. Nathaniel paid the liveryman generously for his discretion, then helped Eleanor and Thomas board. As they prepared to depart, a commotion rose from the direction of the main street, shouts, the thunder of hooves, men's voices calling orders. Holbrook's men, Nathaniel surmised, urging the horses forward. We need to move, now. They left Cheyenne by a little-used trail that skirted the western edge of town, avoiding the main roads where they might be easily spotted. Eleanor held Thomas close in the wagon bed, her new wedding ring catching the midday sun as she stroked the boy's hair reassuringly. Are we going home now? Thomas asked, confusion evident in his young face. So much movement, so many changes in such a short time. We're going to make a home, Eleanor corrected gently. In South Pass City for now and then, perhaps on grandfather's land, when the court confirms it's ours. With Mr. Warren, too. Eleanor glanced at Nathaniel's back as he guided the horses, his shoulders set with determination. Yes, with Nathaniel. He's family now. The word felt right on her tongue. Family. Not born of blood, but forged through shared struggle, mutual respect, and growing affection. A family of choice rather than circumstance. As they crested a hill, leaving Cheyenne behind, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of hope. They had accomplished what they came for, filed their legal claims, secured Thomas's guardianship, formalized their union. The path ahead remained dangerous, but they faced it together, stronger than they had been alone. Nathaniel glanced back, catching her eye. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of all they had overcome and all that still awaited. Then he smiled, a rare and guarded expression that transformed his features from handsome to breathtaking. Eleanor returned the smile, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Whatever came next, Holbrook's rage, her uncle's vengeance, the uncertain outcome of their legal battle, they would face it as a family, unowned, unclaimed, but bound by choice and growing love. The wagon rolled westward into the afternoon sun, carrying its precious cargo toward a future yet unwritten, but full of promise. As the miles passed beneath their wheels, Eleanor Warren looked up at the vast Wyoming sky and felt for the first time since her father's death truly free. Siena. 1 month later, the territorial courthouse buzzed with anticipation as Judge Carlton entered the packed chamber. Every seat was filled with spectators standing along the walls, ranchers, townsfolk, reporters from as far away as Denver, all drawn by the sensational case that had become the talk of the territory. Eleanor sat at the front beside Nathaniel, Thomas between them, in his Sunday-best hair, slicked down with water that was already beginning to dry into its natural waves. The past month in South Pass City had brought color to the boy's cheeks and confidence to his bearing. He no longer flinched at sudden movements or loud voices' progress that warmed Eleanor's heart. Across the aisle sat Uncle James and Judge Holbrook, flanked by expensive lawyers brought in from Laramie and even Denver. James glared openly at Eleanor, while Holbrook maintained a facade of dignified concern that didn't reach his cold eyes. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Carlton took his seat. The Territorial Court of Wyoming is now in session, Judge William Carlton presiding. The formalities proceeded with ponderous dignity. Statements of the case introductions of the parties involved preliminary motions from the attorneys. Eleanor listened with growing confidence as their lawyer, provided by Judge Carlton himself, systematically presented the evidence supporting their claims. Benjamin Hayes's original deed and will. Margaret Hayes's correspondence documenting James's fabricated debts. Thomas's birth certificate proving his relationship to Eleanor. Testimony from Pearson about Eleanor's condition when Nathaniel brought her to his way station, still wearing the dress from the auction block, bruises visible on her face and arms. With each piece of evidence, the narrative became clearer. A systematic conspiracy to defraud a family of their rightful inheritance, culminating in the attempted sale of Eleanor herself to erase the final legal obstacle. Holbrook's attorneys fought back fiercely, painting Eleanor as mentally unstable, Nathaniel as an ex-convict with a grudge, Thomas as a disturbed child whose stories couldn't be trusted. They produced witnesses who swore James Hayes had legitimately purchased his brother's debts, that Eleanor had agreed to the auction voluntarily to settle accounts. But their carefully constructed facade began to crumble when Judge Carlton allowed Thomas to testify. The boy stood straight and spoke clearly, describing the mistreatment he had suffered in Judge Holbrook's home, the whispered conversations he had overheard about getting rid of the Hayes girl, the night he had escaped after a particularly severe beating. Eleanor's heart swelled with pride at his courage, even as it ached for what he had endured. Beside her, Nathaniel's hand found hers, squeezing gently in silent support. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter. Matthews had continued investigating, even after their departure from Cheyenne, digging through old records and interviewing former ranch hands from the Warren property. He had uncovered a witness to Benjamin Hayes's murder, a stable hand who had seen Henry Warren, Judge Holbrook, and James Hayes meeting the night before Benjamin was arrested, planning how to frame him for Miller's death. The man's testimony, delivered with simple dignity, despite obvious fear, cast the entire case in a new light. This wasn't just about land or inheritance, it was about covering up a murder that had destroyed a family. As the evidence mounted, Eleanor watched her uncle's face transform from confidence to concern to barely concealed panic. Holbrook maintained his composure better, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed his recognition that the tide had turned against them. When all testimony had been heard, Judge Carlton called a recess to consider his ruling. The hour that followed was the longest of Eleanor's life, despite Nathaniel's steady presence beside her and Thomas's hand clasped trustingly in hers. Finally, the bailiff announced the judge's return. The courtroom fell silent as Carlton took his seat, expression grave as he surveyed the assembled crowd. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony in this matter, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "I find in favor of Eleanor Hayes Warren and her husband, Nathaniel Warren." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern glare. "The land and property of Benjamin Hayes, illegally held by James Hayes, is hereby restored to its rightful heir, Eleanor Hayes Warren, as stipulated in Benjamin Hayes' legal will." Judge Carlton's gaze moved to where James sat, ashen-faced. "Furthermore, James Hayes is ordered to provide a full accounting of all profits derived from said property during his unlawful management to be paid to Mrs. Warren as restitution." Eleanor hardly dared breathe as the judge continued. "The guardianship of Thomas Miller is confirmed to Eleanor and Nathaniel Warren, with all legal rights and responsibilities thereto." Carlton's expression softened slightly as he looked at Thomas. "The boy has suffered enough displacement and deserves the stability of a permanent home with family who clearly care for his welfare." Only Nathaniel's hand, warm and steady around hers, kept Eleanor grounded as the judge delivered the final portion of his ruling. Additionally, this court finds sufficient evidence to warrant a criminal investigation into the circumstances surrounding Benjamin Hayes's conviction and execution in 1875. Carlton's voice hardened. "I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for immediate action, with specific focus on the roles of James Hayes, Judge Edward Holbrook, and the late Henry Warren in potential conspiracy, perjury, and accessory to murder." Chaos erupted on the opposition side of the courtroom. Holbrook rose to his feet, face mottled with rage, while James seemed to collapse in on himself, head in hands. Their attorneys conferred urgently, papers shuffling as they sought some legal maneuver to counter the devastating ruling. But Judge Carlton wasn't finished. He raised his voice above the commotion, commanding silence once more. This court is not blind to the attempts to intimidate witnesses and obstruct justice that have characterized this case from the beginning. His stern gaze swept the room. Let it be known that such tactics will not be tolerated in my courtroom or in this territory. The rule of law must apply equally to all regardless of wealth or position. With a final bang of his gavel, he concluded the proceedings. Court is adjourned. Eleanor sat stunned, unable to fully process the magnitude of their victory. Years of injustice, of loss and struggle had culminated in this moment of vindication. Her father's name would be cleared, her mother's suffering acknowledged, Thomas's future secured, and beside her Nathaniel, the man who had knelt instead of claimed, who had fought for her cause as his own, who had become more than a strategic partner in their month together in South Pass City. We won, she whispered, turning to him with wonder in her voice. We actually won. Nathaniel's eyes, usually so guarded, shone with emotion. You won, Eleanor. Your courage, your determination, those won the day. Our courage, she corrected, including Thomas in her gaze. Our family's courage. As they rose to leave, they were surrounded by well-wishers. Matthews beaming with pride at his role in uncovering the final evidence, Pearson, who had traveled all the way from his way station to witness the proceedings, even Rising Moon and Eagleheart, dignified in their traditional dress among the crowd of settlers. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her grip on Nathaniel's hand, anchoring herself to this new reality where justice had prevailed, where a future stretched before them, unencumbered by the shadows of the past. Outside the courthouse, spring sunshine bathed the street in golden light. Thomas ran ahead, releasing some of the energy constrained during the long proceedings, while Eleanor and Nathaniel followed at a more measured pace. What happens now? She asked quietly. Nathaniel considered, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. That depends on what you want, Eleanor. The ranch is yours. We could settle there, rebuild what your father started. Or we could stay in South Pass City, where we've begun to make a life these past weeks. Or, she prompted when he hesitated. Or anywhere else you choose. His eyes met hers directly. Our marriage was for legal protection, but where we go from here, that's for you to decide. Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him fully. The man before her had transformed from stranger to protector to partner in the space of 2 months. A man who consistently placed her choices, her agency, at the center of every decision. What I want, she said carefully, is a home for Thomas. A place where he can grow up safe and loved. She took a breath, gathering courage for the words that mattered most. And I want you there with us, Nathaniel. Not because of legal documents or practical arrangements, but because these past weeks have shown me what kind of man you truly are. Something vulnerable flickered in his expression. And what kind of man is that? The kind who kneels instead of claims, who protects without possessing, who loves. She faltered briefly, then continued with greater certainty. Who loves in a way that makes others more free, not less. Nathaniel stood very still, as if afraid any movement might shatter this moment. Eleanor. He said her name, almost a prayer on his lips. Our marriage began in a strategy, she acknowledged, but I find myself hoping it might continue it as something else entirely. In answer, Nathaniel drew her gently into his arms, their first true embrace as husband and wife. Eleanor went willingly, feeling the strength in him, the careful restraint that had always characterized his touch. I have loved you, he confessed against her hair, since you stood in that wagon and asked me, what now, with defiance in your eyes, despite everything you'd endured. Eleanor laughed softly, remembering that first night at the cabin. I didn't trust it. The silence, the stillness, the lack of demands. And now, she leaned back to meet his gaze. Now, I understand that true freedom isn't about being unclaimed. It's about choosing to belong where you're valued for exactly who you are. Thomas called to them from further down the street, impatient with their delay. Eleanor smiled at the boy who had become so dear to her in such a short time. He's waiting for us, she said. Shall we go home, wherever that might be? Nathaniel's smile, rare and transformative, was answer enough. Together they walked toward Thomas, toward a future built on choice rather than coercion, on love, freely given rather than possession. Eleanor Hayes Warren had entered the auction barn as merchandise to be sold. She emerged from the courthouse as a woman who belonged to no one but herself, who had chosen her family, her path, her love. Some things, after all, could never be auctioned, the heart chief among them.